Hello. What comes into your head when I say the word God? That's probably the most important thing about us. So just think about that for a moment. What comes into your head when I say the word God? Andy.
Oh, you're asking me?
I'm asking you.
He's a God of power and might. He's the God who knows everything. He's a God who is holy and pure and good and righteous. He's the God of love and kindness and grace. I feel a sermon coming on for you.
Yeah. Before that starts, I'll just say, that's all of those are right. You could give us Bible verses. You could do a sermon or a home group study on that. And most of us would say exactly the same things, whether we reading our Bibles regularly or we're teaching our kids. We know those things about God. The difficulty comes when life comes and hits us and difficulties arrive, and it kind of shakes that. And what happens is I discover that there's actually a gap between what I say I believe about God, and I do believe it as a Christian, but how I actually live. There's a kind of gap between those two things. I don't think we're all the same. We all have what we say and we believe to be true, but how we actually live that out is not necessarily the same.
Give some examples.
So I show that there's a gap in my life when I run after and I desire things other than God. I find other things more beautiful, more attractive, more interesting than God. I'd kind of rather watch the telly, watch Netflix than spend time reading my Bible and praying. I'm sure I'm not the only one. When I worry more about what other people think, my friends think, than I care about what God thinks of me. And this is a classic one for me. When something bad happens, I stop trusting that God loves me. I think he's gone away and left me and he's being mean. Those are life's experience comes along and it shows what I really believe about God. And there's that kind of gap there.
Yeah, I think that's fair, isn't it? And that's the reason why we're going to be looking at this book of Isaiah, isn't it? Because the book of Isaiah helps us to minimise the gap, to bring those two things closer together. So let me ask you a question. You think of Isaiah, what verses come into your mind?
Well, I love Isaiah. I haven't known it very well, but say Isaiah 40, the famous verses about running and not growing weary, walking and not being faint, and soaring on wings like eagles. That's lovely. It's very comforting. It's very encouraging. I love the Christmas verses about unto us a child is born. I love the Easter verses about the servant who's going to suffer. Just the well-known verses. Okay. How about you? What do you like?
I'd throw in the end of the book where you have this beautiful kind of vision of the new creation, the new heavens and new earth. It's magnificent. And then there are probably verses all the way through, aren't there, that are well known. Well, it seems to me what God could have done is simply to have created almost like a Gideon's Bible version of Isaiah, so that at the beginning of a Gideon's Bible you have all those little helps, don't you? If you're feeling sad, look here. If you're feeling angry, disappointed, and really, really useful. Well, why give us the whole book of Isaiah? Why not simply cut out the rest of it? And I think the answer is because here is a book that has, where the truth of God is being applied to real people in real situations like us. I mean, okay, it's, several thousand years ago and it was a completely different world, but they're basically human beings like us. And what I think Isaiah is seeking to do is to help those people close the gap. And he wants to help us close the gap. So my problem is I live in this world and I get, it hurts a little bit and that starts to affect my view of God. I read the BBC website, bad things are happening, it starts to affect my view of God. I start to believe lies about God. As I look at the Bible, I see the truth about God.
So you start to think, does he really know what he's doing? Is he really on it? This all looks like it's going scarily out of control. in a kind of sort of national scale and individually in our lives as well. So yeah, it's very easy to believe those lies about God. And those people living 2,000 years ago who Isaiah's written to, they were living in very uncertain times. They were living in turbulent times. There were wars and really dangerous things going on, really scary. They were sinful. They were running after other things other than God, just like us in so many ways. And so I think as we read their story and the way that God is working in them and through them, we can look at that and we can realise He's the same God and He loves us, His people, like He loved them.
And they're the same people, so this is real.
Yes.
There's a reality.
Yes. It's not a textbook.
Yeah.
It's a story, and that's really important. And it's a beautiful story. One of the things that can really help us looking at Isaiah is to see where it fits into the big story of the Bible. And so I thought I'd just do a very brief overview of the Bible. If you haven't looked at a Bible overview before, it's a really helpful thing to do. I'd really encourage you to do it. So we start with creation. God creates a beautiful world and He creates men and women to live in that world. And everything looks great, everything looks wonderful. But then they sin, they disobey God, they turn against Him, and the fall happens. Where there's a gigantic dislocation of everything in the universe. It's broken. It's a broken world, broken people. And we think, how is God going to sort this out? He chooses a man, Abraham. In Genesis 12, 1-3, He makes wonderful promises to Abraham of a people, a land, and that Abraham's people will be a blessing to all nations. And then through the history of the Old Testament, we get wandering in the desert, there's sin, there's slavery, all sorts of things happen. And finally, God takes them into this land, the land of Israel, and He gives them kings to rule over them. There's King David, who's great, King Solomon, his son, who's not so great. And then under Solomon's son, there's a catastrophe. Israel had been made up of 12 tribes. And what happens in the time of Solomon's son is that the 10 tribes of Israel become the northern kingdom. That there's basically civil war. The kingdom's fractured, and these people are taken into exile. That's in 722 BC, an absolute national catastrophe. And then years later, there's just tiny little Judah is left. And in 585 BC, Assyria comes and threatens little tiny Judah, and that's where Isaiah is placed. That's where Isaiah is written to. So we'll go into more detail later, but that's just to help you see where Isaiah comes in the Bible story. Isaiah is not only here though. Isaiah points forwards to, wonderfully, the cross and the ultimate rescue of Jesus when He dies on the cross. And as Andy's already said, it points even further forwards to heaven, to the place where God is going to bring His people ultimately. So that's Bible overview with just whereabouts Isaiah comes in. I hope that's helpful.
I thought we'd start by thinking about what is a prophet, because most of the time when we talk about a prophet today, what we think of is somebody who can foretell the future. And of course there are elements of that in the prophet Isaiah. But I think, I hope this isn't offensive to Isaiah, but I think he acts like two types of dog. And actually prophets in general act like two types of dog. A guard dog and an assistance dog, like a blind dog or something like that. And part of his role is to be a guard dog. So God has given His people the covenant. He's told them how He wants to live in relationship with Him. Not very different to a married couple. This is how we're going to live together. Please don't break this covenant. And Isaiah's job is to kind of bark at the people when they're in danger of breaking that or have broken
To kind of
that
warn
covenant.
them. Yeah.
To warn them.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
It's kind of barking as they head off the wrong way here, barking as they head off the wrong way here. Warning, don't go outside, don't leave this glorious covenant God has given you. So that's one side of it. And then the other side is like an assistance dog, because the job of an assistance dog isn't just to, make sure they, somebody isn't pulled off in the wrong direction, but it's to lead them towards something that's good. So if it's an assistance dog for a blind person, it's to lead them down the safety of a pavement. It's to lead them towards whatever lies at the end for them, a shop or a friend's home, where they want to go.
Yeah.
And again, Isaiah is doing that here. He's leading us towards God's future. God has a glorious hope for the people, a beautiful land for them, this new creation that we've kind of seen here. This is where God wants to lead them to. So guard dog, assistance dog, and therefore the big themes in Isaiah are themes of judgment and themes of hope as well.
Judgment if they go away from God and break his covenant, and hope if they keep trusting him and keep going the way he wants them to go.
So, all right, that's what a prophet is. Tell us a bit about Isaiah, because we may know things about him.
Isaiah, we don't know a lot about him, considering how big the book he writes is. He lived about 740 years before Jesus was born, so about 2,300 years ago, by my maths. Mm-hmm. He was highborn, so he had access to speak to the ruling people of the time. And the really dramatic introduction to Isaiah, when he stands on the threshold of the temple in his home city of Jerusalem, and he hears God calling him to be a prophet and to speak God's words to the people. Those are words that changed his life forever. And we'll see that in Isaiah 6, very striking passage. So he was speaking to the southern kingdom, the two tribes which are called Judah, when the country of Israel split. That's his kind of mission field. The time that he's writing in, King Uzziah had just died, and Uzziah had been a relatively good king. He'd messed up a bit, but it had been a golden age, a long reign, and a time of prosperity and good things going on for Israel. But it was also a time when there were huge threats looming from the north. So if you were able to just draw us a map.
Ooh, this is going to get exciting. This isn't exactly my gift, but here we go. So you've got kind of Turkey up here, then we've got the eastern shore of the Mediterranean here, and it goes along to Egypt kind of down here. And then I guess here we've got, I can't quite remember what they're called, but something like the Red Sea or... my father-in-law's going to be appalled at me now. Okay, so that gives you a rough kind of idea. And we're talking about Jerusalem being here and Samaria being here. So this is Samaria, and that's gone before.
That's the northern.
Yeah. That's the northern kingdom, and that's kind of curtains.
It's been
smashed up, gone. And then down here is Jerusalem, which is the capital of the southern kingdom here of Judah. And what happens is you've got, first of all, Assyria, kind of based in Nineveh, probably a bit further over that way. And first of all, they come sweeping down and they take out Samaria. And then we're going to see they start to attack in another wave, if you like. They start to attack Jerusalem. So that's going to be part of it.
So that's Assyria.
That's Assyria. Sorry, let's just make that really clear. That's one big superpower. And then you've got another superpower, again, probably further off this way, from Babylon. And that is kind of looming on the horizon as Isaiah is writing, but they're going to come and attack and finally conquer and take into exile Jerusalem.
So Assyria and Babylon are the two big enemies of Judah, and that's just worth knowing when we read the book through.
Yeah.
So it's a time of great threat and uncertainty, and fear. Isaiah was married and he had 2 sons. His wife was a prophetess, apparently. You know very little about her. And he had a little band of faithful disciples. He was obviously pretty courageous. He spoke truth to power in a way that was very unpopular, made him very unpopular. And this isn't in the Bible, but it's thought that he was probably, because of what he said, he was probably sawn in two at the end of his life after the 4th king mentioned in Isaiah.
And could be in the Bible, because in Hebrews 11 it talks about some being sawn in two. Yeah.
Possibly under the reign of the very evil king Manasseh, it seems that he was killed. Courageous man who spoke God's truth.
So that's Isaiah. Let's now think about, you've given us, if you like, the big picture of the Bible. Give us the big picture of Isaiah itself. Help us to get to grips with that.
I think it's really exciting. If you look at Isaiah chapter 1 verse 2, it's a very dramatic opening. Isaiah is calling on heaven and earth to listen to God's verdict on his people. God is pronouncing verdict on his people, and Isaiah is saying, hear heavens, hear earth, to what's going to be said. So this is much bigger than just this little kingdom of Judah. This is about the whole world. And Isaiah speaks a lot about 2 different cities. So it could think of it in terms of place, a story about 2 cities. He begins with the sinful Jerusalem, God's people in Jerusalem. They're meant to be a light to the Gentiles, but they are worshipping other gods. There's terrible injustice. They're not caring for the vulnerable, and they're looking to other nations. So rather than looking to God to help them from their enemies, they're looking to other nations to help them. They're not trusting God. There's a lot of corruption. There's false worship going on. A lot of kind of hypocritical religion, just keeping the rules. It's a mess, basically, Jerusalem, and under great threat. And then the other place is the New Jerusalem. So there's the old earthly Jerusalem, and then the new heavenly Jerusalem, which Isaiah talks about as well. The place where things will be made well again, and there'll be no more sin, there'll be no more trouble. And the way that Isaiah tells us that we can move from the old, sinful, messed up Jerusalem to the heavenly Jerusalem is through this kind of slightly mysterious figure who appears just kind of out of nowhere in chapter, in the sort of 2/3 of the way through Isaiah, the servant. And there are these servant songs describing the servant. And we know, because we're here on the timeline, we're in the New Testament, we know that servant is Jesus. And you just read it and you think, well, that's obviously talking about Jesus. That's kind of the big picture of Isaiah. His writing spans the reigns of 4 kings. So Uzziah, who's just died, Jotham, Ahaz and Hezekiah. And we get insights particularly into Ahaz and Hezekiah and the way that they, as men, believe, as Jewish men, how they respond to God, whether they respond with faith or with fear. We've already said it's a time of great uncertainty. Judah was tiny. We think a lot about Judah and Israel, but actually on the world map, they were tiny. They were very small. And the people were trying to just make sense of the confusion, of the fear, of the promises that God made to them back in Genesis. How was God going to make those promises come true? Because it didn't look like it. It really didn't look like it when you looked at the world stage. So the first half of Isaiah is mainly about the big threat of Assyria, and then the second half of Isaiah, it moves to the threat being Babylon. But I think that in the beginning of the letter, Assyria actually ruled over Babylon, but in the second half of the letter, Babylon becomes a superpower. Andy, you've seen some stuff about Assyria to get the kind of the feel of how scary they were in the British Museum. Tell us about.
Yeah. So if you go to the British Museum, there's lots of kind of history there, and now you're putting me on the spot. But I think there's a town when Assyria came and attacked during Hezekiah's reign. There's a town called Lachish here, and Lachish was taken by Sennacherib, who was the king of Assyria at the time, and we have a whole load of fabulous kind of is tablets the right word? Kind of huge, great slabs of stone with carvings in them, showing what happened as Lachish was sacked. What we don't have is any of Jerusalem being sacked because he didn't get that far. But there's all of that kind of stuff, and then there's lots of kind of stuff from Assyria as well, and you can see that.
Carvings.
Yes.
That they had, like, really scary. I mean, it would have been really. They were a terrifying enemy, a fierce and a violent, and dangerous enemy.
They've got a gatepost from Nineveh in there or something. So there's lots.
Something really, really scary. And it's kind of hard for us to imagine how terrifying it would have been to live under that threat. I mean, bigger, I think, than living in this country, watching the Nazis kind of trample over Europe. Their city was besieged, their precious, their beautiful temple full of gold, and that was so significant to them. That was where God dwelt under massive threat. So it's hard for us to imagine how frightening it would have been for them. And I guess, that is where it kind of hits with us.
So the question really in the midst of all of this is very simple. Is God who he says he is? Will he be faithful to his promises and his people?
Yeah, these promises.
Yeah. And will his people trust him in the midst of all of that pain and difficulty and hardship? So that's what's going on there. Tell us a bit about some of these words that we have in the book.
Well, Isaiah, his big name, why we were asking at the beginning, what comes into our head when we think of the word God. If you'd asked Isaiah that question, he would have without doubt said the Holy One of Israel.
Right.
That is the title that is given to God in Isaiah, the Holy One of Israel, and hopefully we'll be coming back to that a lot, and whether we're going to choose to trust him or not. Isaiah's a fantastic book to read, even if you just dip in and out of it. But we lose some of it in our English translations because we lose the power and the richness of the Hebrew. So just things that have struck me when I've been reading through Isaiah. I know absolutely no Hebrew at all apart from shalom. That's the limit of my Hebrew. But when I read sort of people who translate Hebrew, our English uses the word poor, poor people, but the literal meaning of that is the downtrodden, is those at the bottom of life's heap. And I just find that much more powerful, thinking about people at the bottom of life's heap rather than just the word poor. So there are very vivid word pictures that Isaiah paints. Very beautiful pictures of light and darkness. That's another very powerful sort of pictures that he paints in Isaiah. We probably know some of those passages from Christmas. And then he talks about the end times, times of cosmic judgment involving the moon and the sun, terrifying God's judgment on the earth, but also God's tender comfort for his people. So again, these two themes of judgment and rescue come out really powerfully.
So really rich themes and words in all of this.
And hopefully that's what we'll explore as we look through Isaiah.
Okay, the other thing is you've got the gospel in Isaiah. So we've got kind of, as we look back this way from the cross, there's lots going on. As Fiona said, God portrays himself as the Holy One of Israel, and you see that specifically in Isaiah 6. Rodney will be talking about that in November. We see that the people are sinful again and again and again, but God is holy. There are hints of the gospel a lot. Isaiah is actually quoted 66 times in the New Testament, and it bears great witness to the Lord Jesus Christ himself. Many quotes about Jesus. Jesus himself starts his ministry by quoting from Isaiah 61 verses 1 and 2 at the beginning of his ministry. He assumes the role of the servant. In John 12, actually, it says that Isaiah saw Jesus' glory.
That's amazing, isn't it?
We'll come to that. Yeah. And then, of course, in Acts, the Ethiopian eunuch is looking at, Isaiah 53?
Yes.
And Philip comes running up to the chariot and explains how that points towards Jesus. So there's an awful lot going on there. And in the kind of the 50s, there's this servant king that we've thought of who will suffer and give his life for his people to take their sin.
I think it's really interesting how that kind of links up with what we've been looking at in Mark, because this servant is a preacher, and we've heard, I think it was Andy was saying, and Josh said that Jesus's priorities in Mark is to teach the people, and Peter, the disciples, they hate this idea of Jesus being persecuted and dying. They don't get it. They disagree with Jesus, and yet I guess if they'd understood Isaiah, they wouldn't have been surprised and horrified when Jesus said what he was going to do.
There's quite a missional aspect to this book. So, when we go from here forwards into the new creation, what we see is that people from all different cultures and nations and tribes are flooding in to this wonderful new creation of God. So therefore, there's a sense that the good news has to go out to all the nations. So that's here as well in the book. So Isaiah's missional.
So God's people were meant to be the ones who shared God's good news with the world, and they completely failed and messed up. And so the servant becomes the light to the Gentiles, to us, and we can hear the gospel, and we can go to heaven as a result of that.
So Fiona, if I was wanting to dive into this a little bit myself, maybe I'm wanting to read along in my own times with the Lord, but it's a bit daunting and I need a bit of help. Where can I go if I want to study it maybe a bit more? What would you recommend in terms of books and stuff?
Well, one of the things I did was I got good old David Suchet to read me Isaiah, because it is quite hard to read and he reads really well. So I just listened to it in the car, him just reading.
So you can get that on the YouVersion YouVersion app on your smartphone. He will do that. Yep.
The other thing you could look at is the Bible Project. If you look at Bible Project, I don't know what they're...
Google it.
Google Bible Project, and they will give you an overview of Isaiah, which again is really helpful. I think that's about 7 or 8 minutes, so it's not like a long time if you haven't got very long. They're really good. There's loads of books here. I have not read them all. I've read bits of some of them. Tim Chester, Isaiah for You. Tim Chester writes very clearly, quite straightforwardly. That probably would be a good one to start with.
That would be great for your own personal times with the Lord.
He asks questions.
That's great.
This is a good
Bible Speaks Today.
Some commentary. Again, I haven't read all of it, but I've just read bits of it. David Jackman, he helps us to know how to teach Isaiah. So to be honest, I've been using that with Women on Wednesday. This is a new book which I've not come across before.
Isaiah Surprising Salvation by Kirk Patson.
That's been good. And then these two are pretty heavyweight.
Well, this one is, isn't it? This is Arimatea, the prophecy of Isaiah. That's kind of... that is a heavyweight, but a great commentary. And this one's slightly different, isn't it?
Yeah,
Talk us through that.
This is a devotional book, which
it's called Isaiah by the Day, a new devotional translation by Arimatea.
Alec Mattia, I think he may well have died now.
Yes, he has.
is a Hebrew scholar, and he is the one who, I mean, I didn't follow everything he wrote, but particularly he explains the meanings of the words, and I found that really helpful.
Well, he does his own translation.
Yeah.
And then you've got little footnotes, and then at the end of each one, you have some kind of thoughts for the
devotional.
day. And that would actually be a nice devotional as well.
I couldn't go through it every day because there's too much in it, but I just worked through it really slowly, and I did find that really good.
Just as we finish up, Fiona, help us a little bit with the application of all of this, how it applies to us.
Well, it's weird, isn't it? Because Assyria, Babylon, they've long since crumbled into the dust. Thousands of years ago, they are no more. So kind of what is the relevance to us? What is the relevance of this? But I guess as we look at Isaiah together, hopefully as we see God, the Holy One of Israel, our faith in him, our trust in the fact that he kept his promises to his people here, means that we live here, that we will trust that he'll keep his promises to get us to heaven, that he will gather his people together. Because sometimes it doesn't feel like it, does it? We're a minority in this world. We have different views to lots of people, and it's difficult being a Christian. And God will gather his people, but we trust that he'll gather his people and take us to heaven. And I guess the temptations that the kings in Isaiah faced, Ahaz, he was tempted to look to other things to help him and support him rather than God. What are we tempted to look to help us when we're in trouble? And Hezekiah, he faced a terrible threat, and how he responded again is really relevant to us. Really a bit of a killer question, a bit of a killer challenge in Isaiah is if we look at chapter 7 verse 9, King Ahaz is faced with these enemies attacking him, and he's challenged by Isaiah, if you do not stand firm in your faith, you will not stand at all. And sadly, it's a bit of a spoiler, but Ahaz doesn't trust in God. He doesn't rely on God. And that's a big warning for us.
And then there's the flip side of that. Therefore, if we do stand firm in our faith, we will stand. It's a wonderful promise to us. Yeah.
I remember I was chatting to a friend of mine about Isaiah and just saying, well, surely it's not just the same, just trust God every single Sunday is going to get a bit wearing, isn't it? If that's the only application of Isaiah to us. And she said, but there are so many different areas in our lives where we need to trust God. There are so many different difficult situations that we face, nationally, internationally, personally, that we need to keep hearing this because it is hard to keep trusting God. I'm excited. I hope this will really help us.
Fiona, thank you for doing all this with us. How you're teaching this in Women on Wednesday? How are they enjoying it?
Yeah, they're enjoying it.
Good.
It's a great group. Some have been Christians for years, some not so long, but I think there's always something to learn, isn't there? So yeah, it's
great.
encouraging.
All right, well, we will be starting the series very soon. We'll just do a little introductory sermon, and then we're going to get into those first few chapters of Isaiah, and hopefully by the time we get to Christmas, we'll have come to that glorious chapter 9, and the beautiful picture of the Lord Jesus coming.